I've talked about this as we've gone through the book of Job a little bit, and I just want us to kind of set the lay of the land a little bit, not with the introduction to Job as I've done in the past, but more to talk about something that is a broader narrative, broader arc of Scripture that I don't think that we always see. You know, we read through, you start reading the Bible, a lot of people start in Genesis and read through the first few chapters there, and of course we know it's the creation account of God creating the universe and creating the world and all that's in it. And we don't necessarily think a lot about that, but I've mentioned before, and it's important for the book of Job because we see this throughout the book. But what we see in Genesis is we see in verse 1, of course, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. But then verse 2, and the earth was without form and void. It was shapeless. It was disordered. It was chaotic. And, of course, I'm not going to spend any time talking about how did that happen. And all these different explanations. But the fact of the matter is, if you read Genesis 1-2, you see this description of the earth. And it doesn't, it's just water. Yes, the Spirit is hovering over the water, but you see this description of essentially chaos. The Hebrew words are about this chaos. And if you follow through those days of creation, through chapter 1, then you'll see that God is taking that chaos and he's putting order into it. He divides the day from the night. Never mind, we don't have a sun and a moon yet. That doesn't happen, I think, till day 4. But he divides the day from the night. So he's taking this disorder and he's creating an order. He divides the waters below from the waters above. And so now you have this expanse. And we call that the atmosphere that we, where the air is that we breathe. And then you have dividing the land from the water. And he goes through this. He's ordering things. Then he creates the planets and the stars and the moon and the sun. And he's giving order to things. And, of course, we still have that order. In fact, we look up in the sky, and how do we tell time? How did we tell time before there were clocks? How did we figure out how to create clocks? We studied the stars. I'm not talking about I guess I'm talking about more of a calendar than I am a clock. But we study the stars. Of course, we even measure the time of day by where the sun is. The old sundial, it used the sun. And all of this is in order that God created. And we measure, time of year based on where the stars are, where we are in the as we go around the sun, we see the stars that are, out from the sun, and that all, we use that for a time measurement. All of this is order that God created. And then, of course, as we get down to where God spoke to Adam and to Eve, we see that God created an order. It isn't good that man should be alone. I'll make a helpmeet for him. And he created an order. He created the animals, male and female, and he created them so that they would have yield seed after their kind. They would have, 2 horses will mate and have a horse. And, they won't have a zebra. And that is true for all of the different species. And, of course, that's true for humankind as well. He created male and female. And, of course, we seem to be at a time in our history, our culture today, that's a little confusing to people. And people don't really understand that. They think they can be anything they want. And if they say they're something different, even not male and female. On some places on the internet you can go and you fill out a form of who you are, and it'll give you an option of a bunch of different genders there that are not just male and female. I mean, it's really crazy, but God created an order to things. He created an order that man and woman would be married and be dedicated to one another for as long as they both shall live. He created an order to things. And one of the things that we see he created an order to was on the seventh day, he didn't just rest because he was tired. No, he was giving us a pattern to follow. And what we were supposed to do, what the Israelites were supposed to do on the Sabbath was not merely rest. That wasn't really the point. The point was, don't allow these other things to obscure your worship of God. They were supposed to worship God that day. And that's why there was a restriction on what they could do. They wouldn't have been allowed to go mow their lawn on Saturday. It would have been Saturday, the Sabbath, because that was something that was obscuring their worship of God that day. Or go out on the golf course. That would obscure their worship of God. That would put themselves first. And so God created this order, and one of the things that he created in this order is that we as humans, of course, one of the things that we didn't mention in chapter 1 was that we are created in his image. We are created, essentially it could be used as a verb. We've learned that. We're created to image him, to reflect him to the world around us. But one of the things, the Sabbath, all of that creates this order that God is first. And so, of course, we see that in the what we call the Ten Commandments. We see that in the first commandment. We actually see that indirectly reflected through each and every one of those commandments that we should love God. We should not put anything before him. We shouldn't create an image of him to worship. We shouldn't put ourselves first. All these other commandments, we should honor our father and mother. All of these things are about the order that God created in the week of creation. And then, even as we see through the law that he gave to the Israelites, this was much later on, obviously, but we see that God gave them commandments that were fundamentally about following divine order. And he told them, if you'll do these things, then I'll bless you. Now, of course, if we study Scripture, it doesn't take us very many chapters. We read chapter 1 and chapter 2, and we get to chapter 3, and what do we see? We see sin introduced into the narrative. And what is sin? What is the thing that God had told Adam and Eve would happen if they ate of the fruit of the tree? They would die. And so what we have to understand is in this narrative of God ordering things, death is a disorder. It's reversing God's order that he put into the world, into creation. And so he wants us to live ordered lives. He wants us to order our lives according to his commands. He didn't want Adam and Eve to eat the fruit because that was something he gave them. It was divinely ordered. And yet they ate the fruit. They chose to disobey. They chose disorder, and they received disorder. Disorder came in the form of what we call a curse on the earth, that it would be difficult for man to provide food. So once they sinned, then the whole equation had changed, and now there was this disorder in the world. And guess what? We still have this disorder in the world, don't we? And even today, what does God want us as Christians to do? He wants us to live according to that order, that divine order that he set down, that he gave us. We sometimes call them his commandments. That's his divine order. He wants things to be done a certain way. And generally speaking, when we do them the way God wants us to, he blesses us. That is true, doesn't he? In fact, if we take some time, and we're not going to do this right now, but one of the next books after the book of Psalms is the book of Proverbs. And there's many things in the book of Proverbs, where Solomon says, if you do this, then this. And these are, a lot of times we like to read these as promises, but they're not promises. They are proverbs. They are generalizations. This is how life generally works. And it's true. Even the commandment to honor your father and your mother, and it will be well with you. You'll live a long life on the earth. That's a generalization. It wasn't always true. Sometimes you could obey your parents and you still would die. Okay? But so we understand these things are generalizations. And we like to live by those because we like to even treat them as promises, because then we feel like, well, if I tithe, if I go to church every week, if I tell other people about Jesus, if I do the things that I know I'm supposed to do, then it's like a contract, and God will give me. God will provide. We get something out of this today we call prosperity theology, where if you send money to me, God's going to bless you. No, that's a lie straight from the pit of hell. No, there are generalizations that are true. We call them Proverbs. Proverbs is a book of wisdom. It's wise things. Live wisely, and generally it will go well with you. You know, if you treat people well, generally they'll treat you well. Now, will they always? No. Sometimes you'll run across someone that is just has it out for you. And no matter how well you treat them, they're just not going to treat you well. So what does this have to do with Job? Well, one of the things we've seen as we've gone through the book of Job is that there's a lot of references to creation. And that's going to be true today as well. But I think there's a reason for that. And in fact, if you look at the first couple of chapters of Job, or the first chapter of Job, what you see God describe is that Job is living according to divine order. He is pleasing God. He's fearing God. He has trained up his children to love God. And just in case they happen to sin and don't even know about it, he's making sacrifices on their behalf. He is trusting in God. He is avoiding evil, turning away from evil, eschewing evil, like King James says. He's fearing God and turning from evil. He's living according to that divine order. And what do we see? The description of Job's life in chapter 1, we see that, he's wealthy. We see that God has provided many children. We see that his children, one test of parenting, and I maybe I fail this test. One test of parenting is how much your kids love each other. And Job's kids loved each other. They loved each other so much that, and it appears to be a regular, maybe a weekly, get-together where they would go over to each other's houses and have dinner. That's something in our world today. Do you see that in the world today where, kids love each other well enough to get together? And of course, we see this blessing of God on Job's life. Job lived according to divine order, and God blessed him. And along comes the Satan. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically what we are given insight into in chapters 1 and 2 is that Satan is saying, making the claim, the only reason he's fearing you is because you're giving him this order. In fact, that word hedge is about, this same idea as dividing the day from the night, dividing the land from the sea, this hedge. You've divided him off from the rest of the world, the chaos in the world. You've given him this order. Job ordered his life, and in turn, God ordered things for Job. He created this order for Job. And so God said, well, you think that's true? You really think that's true? Have at it. And so God allowed Satan to reverse the order that God had brought to Job and to bring chaos upon him. Chaos in the form of total destruction and losing all his wealth and his children, and then his own body to have these boils. This was a reversal of God's order into a chaos. This is very important for us to understand this morning, because what we see as we come to chapter 38, verse 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Now, I'm going to come back to those first few words there, but first I'm going to deal with this word whirlwind. This word whirlwind would be the epitome of destruction or chaos. It's not that God was bringing destruction on Job, but why did God appear in this whirlwind? You could think of the whirlwind as a tornado, but probably a massive tornado. Most tornadoes are only, a mile or a mile and a half across, not really that wide. In fact, if they're a mile across, that's pretty big. Usually, tornado can go through and hit a house on one side of the street and not the other side of the street. But we have this whirlwind that God is appearing in. Why is God appearing in a whirlwind? Isn't a whirlwind what has landed upon Job and his family and his life? Didn't Job already experience this sense of destruction? And yet God appears in the whirlwind. His voice comes out of the whirlwind. And I think that the picture that we're going to see as we go through here is that even in the chaos, God speaks to us. And the chaos may be caused by something we do. We may make a choice that's a poor choice, and we are not living according to God's order. That can happen, but that's not what happened to Job. We know this. Job was living according to God's divine order, and yet came this whirlwind, and now God comes in the whirlwind, and he speaks out of the whirlwind. Now let's talk for just a minute about the Lord answered Job. We are now in chapter 38. We've gone through 37 chapters, and from chapter 3 through chapter 37, we had just people speaking. We had Job, we had Eliphaz, we had Bildad, I can't even remember all their names, we had Elihu, we had all these different people speaking and saying all these things. And we mentioned multiple times through the book, God was silent. Why is God answering now? And why is God answering Job? Why isn't God answering Eliphaz or Elihu or any of the others? Or even Job's wife? Well, the reason comes down to this. Job was seeking God. Job had prayed to God. It wasn't your typical kind of prayer, but he turned to God. He asked God to come. He asked, in fact, in the last chapter, we saw where Job had spoken, we saw that he said, God, come and judge me. Come and vindicate me. Remember that? Job was seeking God. And really, this is the first and most important thing that we need to learn. When we go through trials and difficulties in life and don't understand them, whose name do we call? And that's why I chose to sing that song this morning, Let It Be Jesus, the first name that I call. Job didn't know the name of Jesus, but he knew Yahweh, and he called upon Yahweh. So the Lord answered Job, and he answered him out of the whirlwind, symbolizing this. Even in the midst of chaos, God is there. And what does he say? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? I had to do a little bit of research to figure out what does that mean, darkens counsel. It came to me this phrase that's sometimes used. And I don't know exactly how to put it, but someone darkens the doorway. Basically, they appear there and there's a shadow. That's what I think of when I think of darkens. But that's not what he's really saying. He says darkens counsel. And when I looked it up, Another way to say this would be muddies the waters. Confuses things with these words, by words without knowledge. Job had said a bunch of things, and he had challenged God, and he had said, God, you know that I fear you. You know that I live an ordered life. You know that I live the way you want me to, and yet these things are happening to me. Why, God? Have you judged me wrongly? His words were without knowledge. What does he mean his words were without knowledge? Would you consider Job to be a wise man? I would consider Job to be a very wise man. But there was something he was missing. He didn't understand God. He was trying to give explanation for his circumstances, but he didn't understand God's. His words were without knowledge, and as a result, he was muddying the waters. The things he was saying weren't really true or weren't really making sense. Now God says, dress for action like a man. I will question you. You've been questioning me, Job. You've been asking me to vindicate you. I will question you, and you make it known to me. And so this is in the concept of a courtroom. Really, this is gird up your loins, I think the King James says. Dress for action like a man. I would think, pull your big boy pants on. This is more military language. Get your armor on. Prepare yourself intellectually and spiritually for truth, for correction. The book of Proverbs says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. For who is it that the Lord reproves? For the Lord reproves him who he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. Maybe you've had those times with your children where they thought they knew it all. Maybe you're still having those times with your children where they think they know it all. And sometimes you just have to cut to the chase and say, look, you don't know what you're talking about. You need to be corrected. For most of us, though, our children are now adults, and it's past that time of correction, and we simply can wait until they, if ever, come and ask us advice. But Job had framed this as a courtroom. He wanted God to vindicate him. He essentially wanted God to, put him on trial, and so God is granting this trial, and he's about to cross-examine Job. And he begins there, if I have not yet lost count, I think it's verse 4. Where were you? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Now we're going to go through here, and there's really two sections here that God's going to talk about. And the first is going to be just general creation, inanimate objects, creation itself, nature. And then we're going to see the animal kingdom specifically. In these first several verses, verses 4 through 38, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. God's sounds like a little facetious with Job here even. Surely you know. Obviously, you've come to me and told me you know all these things, Job. Surely you know who made its measurements, who determined how big it was going to be, or who stretched the line upon it, or what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waters be stayed. You know, we go to the ocean, and you pretty well know how far down you can walk, don't you? You know, you see the waves, you know, if you can call them waves, you know, the billows rolling in on the seashore there, and you know how far down you can go before you get your shoes wet. You better take them off, or, you know, whatever. I mean, it sometimes comes up a little more, and obviously the tide comes in and out, and so, but you know where the boundary is. God has set a boundary there. It doesn't just wash over the whole land. There's a boundary there. You know, who made that boundary, Job? And of course, you know, all the different things you could think about that God put in order to things in place. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, Job? Have you caused the sun to come up? Or do you just enjoy its rays when the sun comes up? You just go out and you see this beautiful sunrise, and you enjoy it, but you're not the one who's causing it. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? You know, could you go out and tell it, I want the sun to come up earlier today, or maybe I'm a little tired and I want it to come up later today? Could you do that, Job? That it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked will be shaken out of it. You know, Job, can you cause the weather to punish the wicked? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. Job, have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? You know, we're still discovering new things. Now, I'm not talking about space. I'm talking about on earth, in the oceans. We're still discovering things. Perhaps we know more about the stars than we do under the sea. Have the gates of death been revealed to you? One of the things that I find really interesting being a Christian is to listen to these accounts of people who have had what we call a near-death experience, where they have apparently died, where they were in the operating room. Sometime maybe I'll do that for Sunday school, just kind of for fun, just to challenge us and get us to realize, you know, the afterlife is real. There's something real going on here. I enjoy listening to that kind of thing because it gives me that confirmation of what I already know, that there is a spiritual world, you know, that's beyond what we understand. You know, have the gates of death been revealed to you, Job? Do you understand what death is? We don't even understand what life is. You know, we have these atheists who are proposing theories about how life began. They don't know anything. They're saying, well, this could have happened, or that could have happened, or if we do this, you know, then we can get, then these proteins can come together and they can form, or these molecules can come together and they can form proteins. Well, okay, if you form proteins, is that life? Really? You know, at what point does it become life? And oh, by the way, at what point does a human being have a soul? And we know that these things exist because we do have accounts of people who have died, and they can give details of things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to see. I don't want to spend too much time here. I could really go off the deep end here. But Job, you don't understand death. It's not been revealed. Or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? You know, we see a rainbow and we make up this fictitious tale that you can find the end of the rainbow and there'll be gold there. But there isn't an end of the rainbow. If you tried to find the end of the rainbow, you're gonna keep going until you just can't see it anymore, because the sun isn't. If you keep going, it's in the east, right? And so you keep going, and pretty soon it's too far. There's never an end. And where is the place of darkness? So where does light begin? Where's light, the dwelling place of light? Where is the place of darkness? You know, in Genesis, we see that God separated the light from the darkness. God created this order. But Job, do you have any idea where those places are? Do you understand even how to separate those two things? That you may take it to its territory, that you may discern the paths to its home. These are, in a sense, nonsensical questions, but that's because Job doesn't have a clue. That's the point. You know, for you were born then. You know, Job, this is God tongue-in-cheek. Of course, Job, you've told me you know all this stuff. You were born then, weren't you? The number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? You know, where does the snow come from, Job? Where do I keep the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? That's an interesting insight, that God can actually use hail. He can use weather to impact the affairs of men, and we know that he has. We can look back in history. There's stories about the Revolutionary War in particular, where it really appears, you know, to Washington and to these other generals, they pretty much had to conclude God had intervened in certain battles where they would have lost if not for the weather. So God says that he has reserved the hail for time of trouble. Okay? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed? Or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Where does the wind come from? Can you find the source of the wind, Job? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain? You know, how does the rain know where to go? You know, what causes the rain to rain here and not there? You ever see that happen? Where, you know, I know years ago when we were traveling, and we used to travel by car, we just had too many kids to fly, and we would be driving through Kansas. That was the best place to see it, and you could look on the horizon and you could see the storm here and a storm here. You could just see the storms. And sometimes you could even see a rainbow at that storm. It was really interesting. But it wasn't raining here, and it was dry as could be, hot and dry, yet it was raining over there. Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt? Why does the lightning come? We say thunderbolt. It's obviously thunder and lightning are together. One is light and one is sound, but they're all the same, acting together. The thunderbolt, why does it go where it goes? Who directs the thunderbolt, Job? To bring rain on a land where no man is. No one even lives there, and yet God causes it to rain there. On the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land. God even provides rain on the desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass. Has the rain a father? Or who has begotten the drops of dew, Job? For whose womb did the ice come forth? From whose womb? And who has given birth to the frost of heaven? Where did it come from? The waters become hard like stone when it freezes. You can go ice skating. You don't want to fall down. You crack your head open. The waters become hard like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Now we're talking about the stars and the constellations. So now we're not just looking at the earth and the things going on here, but we're looking out there. Then, Job, can you bind the chains? Can you lead forth Mazzaroth in their season? The Mazzaroth was a reference to the 12 constellations. Job, can you lead them forth? Can you cause them to show at the right time of year? Or guide the bear with its children? And again, that was a reference to a constellation. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may cover you? The old, you see the rain dance, we see this on old movies. There might be Indians going out there and doing a rain dance trying to get it to rain. Well, we can't cause it to rain. You might be able to do some things to influence the weather to some degree, but God is the one who actually controls all of these things. Can you establish their rule on earth? See, can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? It's like God is almost playing with Job here. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? Now there's a question for you. Earlier I was talking about research that's done on near-death experiences. There's another body of research that I just find very, very interesting. This brain surgeon who was not a believer, but now he is. And he's a believer partially because he has seen human brains that were either removed because of like tumors. Part of the brain was removed, or in some cases there's atrophy, that kind of thing. And he's seen brains where basically the person should not only not be able to live, but they shouldn't be able to function and think and reason. And yet they can. And so now this neurosurgeon is now a believer because of what he has seen, but who can number, I'm going to go back and read that again. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? They've done enough experiments now that they've concluded that actually thinking, reasoning is not in the actual brain. It's external. It's not physical. And so they've concluded that there must be something that is what we would call the soul that is doing the reasoning. The brain itself isn't doing the reasoning. I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently, but who gave that understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can tilt the water skins of the heavens, cause it to rain here instead of there? When the dust runs into a mass, you see a dust storm, and the clods stick fast together. And so God has now gone through all sorts of different parts of creation and demonstrated that Job doesn't know anything. I'll try to speed up just a little bit here so that people can make it to lunch where they want to go at appropriate times. But now he's going to talk about animals. He says, Job, can you hunt the prey for the lion? Think about that. Where does the lion get its prey? Who provides its food for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their thicket? We call this idea the circle of life. And if you watch the Disney version, you see all these animals holding hands and singing. But that's not what the circle of life is. The circle of life is that one eats another one. And it's not a bad or evil thing. It's just the design that God gave them. And so how do they eat? God provides that. Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? You know, we go out and we see all these deer all over the place. You know, who helps them have their babies? Who takes care of them? We take our animals to veterinarian. And in some cases, they just birth their young. But in some cases, it's necessary for us to help them. But there's deer all over the place. Who helps them? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bring forth their offspring, and are delivered of their young? Their young ones become strong, and they grow up in the open. Nobody has to, teach them. I mean, the parents teach them things, but they, most of the time, animals, when they're born, they just start getting up and walking. I mean, it's amazing. They go out and do not return to them. And a lot of times, that's the way it is too. The young ones just are born and they get up and they might be with their parent for a little bit, but then they go out and they're on their own. Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I have given the arid plain for his home and the salt land for his dwelling place. They're out there in places where man doesn't live. He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains at his pasture. And he searches after every green thing. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger? Well, the wild ox wouldn't do that. And most of these animals that he's talking about here are not domesticated. They're beyond mankind's dominion, really. We have dominion over them, that's true, but you can only do so much to have dominion, say, over a lion. We have these lion tamers or tiger tamers, and they perform in circuses, and we've seen in some cases over the last decade or two that sometimes they get bit by the lion or scratched by them. They're not really having dominion over them, a control over them. These are all wild animals. Almost all of these are wild animals. Let's see. Can you bind him in the furrow with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on him because his strength is great, and will you leave to him your labor? Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but they are the pinions and plumage of love. But are they the pinions and plumage of love? For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them. The ostrich isn't really that smart. But don't get near them. You can get killed by an ostrich. And that the wild beast may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young, as if they were not hers. Though her labor be in vain, yet she has no fear, because God has made her forget wisdom. God has made her really not very smart and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and his rider. Speaking of the horse, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. We use horses as they used horses anyway for war. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver. Bows and arrows and all of that, the quiver. The flashing spear and the javelin, weapons of war. With fierceness and rage he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings around toward the earth? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rocks he dwells and makes his home, on the rocky crag and the stronghold. From there he spies out the prey. His eyes behold it from far away. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there he is. Just all of these pictures of things that are happening in the world, and almost all of them are happening completely without mankind's involvement. You know, Job, you're powerless. I designed all of these things. I put in order to the world. And even when the world is disordered, it is not outside of my control, Job. He's speaking from the whirlwind. Even in the midst of this chaos, God is not, his will is not thwarted. Yes, there may be things that happen to us because of this chaos, this broken world that we live in. But ultimately, God is in control. He is what we call sovereign. Chapter 40, and the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder like you, I'll add the words like you, contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. Now, does God give Job any answers as to why he's suffering? No, he doesn't say anything about Job's suffering. He just lets Job know that I am the creator of all of this, and you cannot even fathom everything that I've created. You can't even fathom it, let alone, you couldn't do this. I mean, it goes without saying. You know, God is not part of the creation. He is the creator. He is other. And Job is part of the creation. You know, shall a fault finder? Why? You know, Job had been finding fault with God. God, are you judging me, wrongly? Well, no, God wasn't judging him wrongly. But that wasn't the question. Job missed the question. Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? And then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. I am vile, King James says, of small account. I am puny. I am pathetic. I am worthless. I am nothing, Job says. That which actually deserves to be accursed. The word vile there, that which deserves to be accursed. Behold, I am of small account. I am vile. What shall I answer you? In other words, I don't have an answer. There's no answer to give to you. No, I will lay my hand on my mouth. I'll shut up. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. Job had already talked way too much. He says once or twice, but actually he talked for chapters. I'll lay my hand on my mouth. He'll do the wise thing. He'll shut up. Did you ever want to tell your kids that? Not that we should use those words, but the reality is sometimes that's what they need to do. So that's what we need to do. We need to shut up. We need to listen to God. We need to behold who he is. We need to see God in all his awesome glory. Job saw this. And I want you to understand something here. There's going to be another couple of chapters where God's going to talk to Job, and then Job's going to react again. But in this particular reaction, what Job said was, I am vile. I have nothing to say. I'm going to shut up now. Job was talking about himself. He was approaching the right direction of humility, but he was talking about himself in chapter 42. The next time Job opens his mouth, he's going to be talking about God. We get to see here a process of a change of heart. First, he recognizes that he is wrong, his insufficiency. And then in chapter 42, we see that he sees ultimately God's total and complete sufficiency, even in the midst of utter chaos, of utter destruction, of utter suffering. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, another wisdom book, Solomon wrote, says, "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few." What a wise thing for us to remember. Let our words be few. When we're going through that time, we'd be better off to keep our mouths shut. And we read last week, Romans chapter 8, and we read that there's times when we don't even know what to pray because we're in that kind of pain. We just, let the Holy Spirit speak for us with groanings that can't be uttered. That's the wise thing for us, to keep our mouths shut and just go before him and trust him, even in tears. That's okay. That's a good thing. That's recognizing our insufficiency, as Job was at that point right now. Now, I know that I'm already over time. I just want us to bring this back to where we started this morning, with understanding that God had created an order to things. And the intent is that that ultimate order will be made complete in eternity future. And yet, this cosmic battle is still going on. We are still living in this broken world. And yes, God has given commands for us to live within his divine order. And lest I leave out the most important part, part of the divine order is that in order for us to live with him as his sons and daughters in heaven for eternity, our sins have to be atoned for. That's part of the order. And he provided a way that Jesus would come and live a perfect life as a human and yet as God, and would be sacrificed on the cross. He would lay down his life to pay that sacrifice, to become the atonement for us. This is all part of fixing the broken ordering of things. This is maybe the core, the kernel, the most important part, and yet the whole arc of history is still about the chaos and order. Even though there's this God of this world that we read of in the New Testament, he's still fighting God's order. He's still trying to bring disorder. But we know that ultimately that will culminate in this completion of redemption. We know Jesus completed the atonement at the cross. That's true. But there's going to be a completion of redemption. Another verse we read in Romans 8 last week was that the earth itself is longing for that day, for that total redemption, that return of full order that was designed and was put in place, that we read of in the Garden of Eden. And we read of that, by the way, at the end of the book of Revelation as well. Once again, a garden. Everything is put back in God's order, God's design. But Satan fights God's order with chaos, with destruction. And we have chaos in our lives, don't we? We have chaos of many different forms in our lives. And I'm going to name a few things, but you think about it, and you think of the difficulty, the things we find ourselves needing to go before the throne and pray for, or we should be. We have disease. We have illnesses that we may or may not understand even. And there may be, doctors that have studied, diseases or the human body and all these things, and yet there are things that are outside of our knowledge that God understands, but we don't. We have these things. This is a form of that chaos, that destruction that we face in our lives. We experience death. Death of those we love. I mean, you just pick up the newspaper, if you can find a newspaper these days, but, turn on the TV, or maybe don't. But you can see death all over the place. This is all part of the chaos. Death of the righteous, death of the unrighteous. And we see this chaos in another place as well. We struggle with relationships, don't we? Sometimes that struggle is a result of our sin, which has alienated people that we love, and yet we've alienated. Sometimes it's not a result of our sin and failure. Sometimes we had nothing to do with it, and yet there's still these relationships that are broken. People have made choices that we wish they wouldn't have made, and essentially they've chosen to defy God's order. We all have loved ones. Some of us have loved ones who do not know Jesus as Savior. This is a disorder, because part of God's order is to bring us into a relationship with Him. And yet, as we read God's response to Job, we clearly see that even though we experience all of this chaos, all of this disorder, all of this destruction around us and in our lives, God is sovereign over all. He speaks out of the whirlwind. He is sovereign over it all. There's no chaos that is somehow beyond His power, beyond His capability to stand up in that boat with His disciples and say, "Peace, be still." There's no chaos that's beyond Him. The question for us is, will we trust Him? Will we trust God, and will we submit to God in reverence, even in the midst of this present chaos, this broken and evil world that we live in? And in some cases, we contribute to that brokenness, that evil, because we make sinful choices at times. And I just want to leave us with this one verse, Romans 8:18. "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us," or in